This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Dr. Craig Zelizer is the founder and CEO of the Peace and Collaborative Development Network. Created in 2007, PCDN has rapidly become the leading online network connecting peacebuilders and change agents from around the globe. Craig is also the Interim Director of the Masters of Arts in Conflict Resolution within the Department of Government at Georgetown University. His most recent publication is an edited volume called Integrated Peacebuilding: Innovative Approaches to Transforming Conflict. Craig was also one of the co-founders and a senior partner in the Alliance for Conflict Transformation, a leading nonprofit organization dedicated to building peace through innovative research and practice. Craig currently serves on the editorial boards of the African Peace and Conflict Journal, Journal of Conflictology, and the Journal of Peacebuilding and Development. He also serves on the boards or advisory boards of several organizations, including Masterpeace, TechChange, the Alliance for Peacebuilding, International Peace and Security Institute, the Amani Institute, and Move This World. I spoke with Craig in Washington, D.C. Hi, Craig. Thanks so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast with me today.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Where am I calling you today?
In Washington, D.C. at Georgetown University.
Excellent. Craig, I know that you have a number of different facets to your career and how you have contributed to the peace and conflict resolution universe. Tell us about what it is you do and how you divide your time.
Okay. So basically I have two almost full-time jobs. My main job is I'm the Interim Director of the Conflict Resolution Master's Program at Georgetown University. And I've been at Georgetown for 9 years, almost a decade. And then the second job is I am the founder of the Peace and Collaborative Development Network, which is one of the world's leading online platforms that's connecting over 33,000 peacebuilders and development professionals and organizations and people interested in social change in general. And that's a for-profit, not that we're making any money. It's kind of we're set up as a for-profit social enterprise.
Tell me about the genesis between both of those. Did you become a professor first and then start the network, or did you start the network and then become a professor? What was the choice to sort of follow both of those paths?
So they're separate things. I try to keep them separate, but I guess in terms of Georgetown, I won't go over my whole career, but basically, I've always, as far back as I can remember, I've been interested in social change in general. And when I was younger, I'm 44 now, and when I was in my teens, I spent a lot of time worrying about nuclear Armageddon, and we had the very active Cold War, which maybe is coming back. I hope not. And so I spent a lot of time, I don't want to oversell it, but spent a lot of time thinking about kind of democracy and also, kind of individual people. And I didn't buy into the idea that everybody who was living in the Soviet Union was evil. It was an evil empire, even though they were competitors of the United States. And when I was in high school, I just had some really wonderful teachers who kind of got me inspired even more about social change and social activism, going to like nuclear disarmament marches or anti-apartheid things, or just local community justice volunteering. And I'd say where it really took off, I'd never been out of the country apart from Canada. And when I went to undergrad, I found a wonderful, incredible major called Social Thought and Political Economy at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And what that major involved is an interdisciplinary study to complex social problems, so drawing on sociology, history, economics, political science, anthropology, and then trying to understand creative ways of facilitating positive social change. So it was an incredibly transformative experience, kind of learning about, structural inequality and, the roots of identity-based conflicts and oppression, but also what are innovative ways to try to address that. And probably the biggest impact on my life is when I was a junior, I knew I wanted to study abroad, and I didn't want to go to a country that all of my colleagues were going to, such as France or the UK or Germany. I mean, nothing against those countries. They're all wonderful. And this is back in 1990, I think. And so I got it narrowed down to 3 countries that I knew nothing about any of them. So one was Poland, one was Hungary, and one was Kenya. And I won't go through the whole sequence of how I decided on Hungary, but basically wound up going to Hungary right after, about 6 months after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, maybe 7 months afterwards. And originally went for just a semester, but it had such a transformative experience, I wound up spending a year and then going back later for 2 more years. So kind of being in a society that was experiencing rapid political, social, and economic change and all the opportunities and wonderful challenges that people were facing was probably the most transformative experience of my life. And also just on a personal level, I suffered, one of the things that is critical for advancing a career in international development or peacebuilding is having as much cultural and language fluency as possible. So I literally suffered through every moment of studying French in high school and was convinced I could never learn a language. I mean, I'm talking about suffering beyond belief. And when I went, and I had to take French at the university too, but when I went to Hungary, I was able to learn Hungarian, which is a difficult language, mostly just because, I took classes, but a lot of it was just on the street and spending time in villages and just being immersed. And so also the ability to speak and communicate in a second language. And in particular, Hungarian, it's a small country of 10 million, and Hungarians are incredibly appreciative if anybody speaks a few words of their language. They think you're amazing. So it's a wonderful language to learn. Some other languages I speak, unless you speak it very well, people are not that appreciative. But Hungarian, just by learning it, people think, oh my gosh, why in the world would you ever learn this language? So I'm not sure where I was going with all that, but kind of that commitment to social change and interest in international affairs has always been there. And when I was living in Hungary, obviously the wars in former Yugoslavia started, so that also had I had friends from former Yugoslavia and spent time in different places. So I was there for about a couple months before the war broke out, and had been to a lot of the places. And so kind of that was the first war. It wasn't my war, but kind of the first war that had personal ties to. Mm-hmm. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Why did you, after those transformative experiences, I'd love to, maybe I'll come and have a coffee with you sometime. I was lucky enough to live in Budapest for 3 years myself.
Yeah.
But after those transformative experiences, how did you choose to then pursue the PhD path rather than, the typical, I'm going to go work for an NGO or the UN or whatever?
Right. So basically, so I finished undergraduate, and then one of the most important parts of my career development has been having amazing mentors, and not so much where I go out and ask someone, are you my mentor? Just building relationships with fantastic people. So when I came back from Hungary, the director of my undergraduate program was very persuasive, and she's like, you should apply for a Fulbright. And in my mind, I was like, Fulbrights are only for important people. I'm not important. And she was very persuasive. So I applied for a Fulbright junior scholarship and got it, and was able to spend 2 more years in Hungary. And so and I won't go again the whole history, but I was doing research, putting my interest together of identity-based conflict in former Yugoslavia. So I was doing research on the Croatian minority living in Hungary. But actually, the research was quite boring. So after a couple of months with another Fulbright colleague, we were just sitting in this high-level conference, quite bored in the back of the room, and started writing notes to each other. And we basically came up with an idea to do work. Hungary has 13 different identity groups or ethnic groups. And there's a huge amount of discrimination, particularly towards the Roma population, which comprise about 8 to 10% of the entire Hungarian population. And so we thought, why don't we do something targeted towards youth around conflict resolution? And so we basically wrote up a concept paper, gave it to the Open Society Institute, and we thought we'd have a meeting with them in a couple of weeks. And then maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, said, oh, that's a great idea, here's some money. So basically we started doing conflict resolution work, and we had to create an organization to actually get the money. And so that kind of, falling into conflict resolution, and I'd already been doing this, when I was living in Hungary. I did some work on the university I was based at. They had like an EU grant, so I was doing work in villages, with different minority groups. So it's kind of starting our own NGO almost by accident.
By chance, when you went to the Open Society Institute, were you working with a gentleman named Scott Abrams?
No, it was a Hungarian gentleman, but this is like probably 92. I don't remember his name. Probably
okay.
Tibor or something.
Okay. Yeah, Scott worked for Open Society. He was a guest on the show a couple weeks back. We just released his episode, and he spent a decade at Open Society. So I thought that would be an interesting connection.
And so basically we created a nonprofit, got funding from lots of different places, and did people know Seeds of Peace, which is basically convening youth across conflict divides. We did that, convening youth across identity divides within Hungary. And one of the great things about being on the Fulbright Fellowship, one, it kind of gave me access because it's prestigious. But 2 is I had all of my living expenses covered. I didn't have to worry about paying myself. So really all the money that we raised went towards the organization, and having that flexibility of kind of having stable funding for a year or 2 years and not having to worry about supporting myself, it really gave me the freedom to do whatever I wanted. And Fulbright liked it too, even though it wound up not being a research project, more applied. They got good PR and press, and they gave us a little bit of money too. And so kind of how I went from that to doing a PhD is, I started doing a lot of conflict resolution work, and I forgot to say, in the late 80s, my brother, who's older, took a peace studies class in college. I read the textbook, and I knew, and kind of like, this is what I want to do. So in Hungary, we're doing all this stuff, but I felt like I really didn't know anything. It was very unsophisticated. So I did a master's at Central European University, and went over to the Czech Republic, where I used to still be there. And then after the master's, I still don't really know anything. So I went for the PhD because I really wanted to learn how to ask better questions and do better practice. And I never intended to be an academic. at all. My goal was to kind of be directly involved in policy and practice. And, through a long kind of roundabout way, I wound up being an academic, or more a pracademic. I don't consider myself an academic.
So how do you bridge that divide? The academic path is usually one of publishing papers, doing more research, getting involved in that way. And you say, I love the term pracademic. That's fantastic. Maybe that can lead us into the PDCN story, or PCDN, sorry. How did you, then bridge that gap to staying practical, and what does that mean for your career? How do you stay practical? Are you doing projects? Are you doing action research? What does that mean?
So the first thing I'd say is, for a lot of people who are motivated to pursue peace building or conflict resolution or international development, most people are motivated by the desire to affect positive social change. And a lot of the faculty who are working in these fields also want to be engaged in the world. So I say by nature, even though theory and research is very important, the idea is we want to be engaged in helping to achieve sustainable social change, or at least understanding the challenges of not doing that. And so I'd say most of the faculty I know in conflict resolution, a lot of them are pracademics or scholar practitioners, where they're doing both academic research, but they're often engaged in on-the-ground projects or partnerships with people doing on-the-ground projects. And for me, I've been at Georgetown 9 years. I'm not tenure track, I'm multi-year contracts. So I do have pressure to publish, and, I do publish a fair amount. But if I was tenure track, I think it'd be much more difficult to do the combination, because the level of publication that would be required would be much higher. So maybe this year I think I've done 3 articles, and, I do books and all that, but not at the same level as most tenure track positions. I couldn't only do conflict resolution theory or book research. I would just find it incredibly frustrating. So I really like to be engaged with people on the ground who are doing some of the most incredible work in the world, and try to think about the critical questions and strategies to help them do it better.
So give us an example of one or two of the projects that you're working on right now, if you're able to do that.
So in terms of concrete projects I'm doing now, so I've done a lot of field work, and that can be anything from trainings to field research to evaluations to capacity building, all over the world. I would say as I've gotten more busy, my ability to do long-term direct on-the-ground projects has been reduced. I don't want to oversell what I do, but so a lot of what I'm doing now is kind of working in partnership with people who are doing the amazing work. And sometimes that's on a research basis. Sometimes that's just on a helping them to kind of stay sane basis. Or, for example, at Georgetown, we have a lot of partnerships with NGOs, and probably my favorite NGO in the universe is called the Parent Circle, which is a joint Israeli-Palestinian NGO comprised entirely of bereaved family members. So there are about 600 to 700 members, half Palestinian, half Israeli. And I think they have the most powerful voice in the world on peace building, because basically everyone in the group has suffered the utmost tragedy of losing a family member, whether it's a parent, an uncle, a child. And in a lot of places, that bereavement or grief would drive people to seek revenge and basically say, we should go out and punish the other side. And for the members of this group, they're not forgiving what happened to their family members, but they're saying their motto is basically, we don't want anyone else to be killed in our loved one name, and they don't want to see a further escalation of violence. So they're basically providing this incredible opportunity of using their suffering as a way to try to advance peace. So for example, we've been working with them. The president of Georgetown adopted them about a decade ago. So, I've done trainings for them. Every time they're in DC, I'm helping to set up connections, give them feedback on their projects, their strategy, help connect them to funding opportunities. So I'm not the one, I've sent students to intern with them, so I'm not the one doing the work, because they're doing the most incredible work, but almost like I'm, let's say, an advocate and also a supporter, and trying to help them think about how do they stay sane in this incredibly difficult environment, and also just always helping them think about how to do better practice and research. So that's kind of an example of a lot of the work that I do now, just because of my schedule and having a toddler at home. I still travel, so I'm going to Ecuador. In the past few months, I've been to Italy or Mexico. I'm going to Ecuador. So Ecuador, I'll be doing a consultancy with Catholic Relief Services, and they're bringing together all of their peacebuilding staff. And there's going to be 2 or 3 external experts. So again, I'm not the one doing the work on the ground. Their peacebuilding staff are, or with their local partners. But I'm kind of there to help think about how do you integrate peacebuilding across diverse sectoral areas. What are the lessons? What are the challenges? So I'd say a lot of my role these days, even though I've done a lot of dialogue and facilitation and peacebuilding work, is more that kind of convening or assisting.
And have you been satisfied with that evolution? It sounds like you were you began, especially through your stories about Hungary and the former Yugoslavia, that being on the ground, connecting with beneficiaries, connecting with affected individuals and groups was the passion that started this. You've moved more into a consultative, supportive, administrative role for some of these organizations. Do you find the same satisfaction with that, or is that just a practical necessity that you've accepted?
I mean, so I think because I get to hang out with some of the coolest people in the universe, so if it was, I've had desk jobs, I won't say at which organizations, where basically I was administering a grant and coordinating everybody else's work, but not doing the interesting work. So that type of role I found incredibly challenging and frustrating, even though I got to travel. So this role I really do enjoy, because it's not, even though I'm not the one in the front lines, most of the time the people I get to hang out with are just the risks they're taking, and kind of the ability they have to cut across conflict divides and just try to go to the core of what needs to happen. So to me, I feel like almost like honored I get to hang out with these people. So I would say I'm still torn sometimes that I might want to be more in the front lines, but kind of being in this more consultative and having a larger field perspective is also really refreshing, because, when you're embedded in a particular project, that becomes your entire universe. And, so these days I'm not embedded in just one project. I have a much broader perspective of how we're trying to build the entire field. And, what does it mean to foster collaboration, impact, and sustainability? But of course, sometimes I just want to get out of DC and, be in a field-based setting and just stay there. Mm-hmm. But with kind of, with personal, professional, and family ties, my wife is from Colombia, so I go there a lot. So I'll be there next month for a couple of weeks. And, so every time I go somewhere, I try to at least connect with peacebuilders. But again, I'm not living in a conflict-affected setting of the U.S. We have plenty of our own conflicts here.
Sure. What, as someone who's a connector, and I'd like to dive in a little bit more to the Peace and Collaborative Network. Mm-hmm. But before we do that, I think stories are always some of the most interesting pieces on these podcasts. You've had the privilege of seeing hundreds and hundreds of different initiatives. Is there one that pops in your mind right now, or a favorite story you like to tell about a surprising result that happened from an initiative that you were working with, or somebody else was working with that you've been told?
It's hard to just think of one.
Maybe something that had an unexpected result where, people said, hey, we're going to go work with youth in, Syria. And what ended up happening was, energizing the diaspora somehow, or something like that.
I mean, there's a project I played some role in. I don't want to, again, oversell, but working in the Caucasus or with people from Georgia and Abkhazia. There was a civil war in 92, or there was a war in 92 to 94. Abkhazia, it's a frozen conflict. Abkhazia says they're independent, and Georgia says you're not. 22 years later, it's still in the same state. And so I'd say there was a really interesting effort funded by USAID going back about 15 years. And the idea was, what could civil society people do to try to advance at least more peaceful understanding between the two sides? And one of the things they figured is everybody across the conflict divide wants their youth to have better opportunity. So this is one of the challenging things in conflict settings. How do you foster initiatives that are going to appeal to all the different parties? So it was a multi-year project, which was great. So it went on for, I think, 5 years, maybe 4 years. And the idea was we started just with youth and had buy-in from both governments. And then from that, kind of leveraged that to a much wider set of collaboration, where the youth started doing their own work, but also tried to use it as a way to connect, not just around youth, but education, and try to build more ties. So that's an example, I think, of a project. I mean, part of the problem with the whole aid or development industry is everything is projectified. And John Paul Lederach, one of the key peace builders, likes to say that, building peace or transforming conflict-affected societies is generational, but most projects are done in 1 to 3 year cycles. And so there's a real fundamental challenge in our field or fields if we're trying to affect long-term societal change, that we only think in terms of 1 to 3 year projects. Those two things are incompatible. So this project that I worked on in the Caucasus, in some ways, was a rare example I saw of kind of multi-year thinking, a systems approach starting at one leverage point. And again, did it end the conflict? No, it's still going on. But it really helped build up a lot of ties. I'm talking, in the, maybe not thousands, at least in the hundreds. And probably was one of the more interesting projects I've had the ability to work on, particularly because it was long-term. And it was very strong local partners. So in terms of surprising amazing results, I can't check something, but in terms of a really interesting design that had a significant impact on the ground, that's probably one of my favorites.
Excellent. So take us down the path of the Peace and Collaborative Development Network.
Sure.
How did that? What was that genesis? And you said you've grown it to a community of 33,000 or more participants. I'm happy to count myself among those numbers. What was the genesis there, and how have you grown it? How did that start?
Before there was an internet, I've always been an information sharer. So even in the undergrad major that I talked about, I started a handwritten newsletter that I would copy and circulate just of interesting activities. And the pre-genesis of PCDN is I having lived in Eastern and Central Europe for many years, one of the things I noticed is that, information is power, which is a famous quote. I don't know who to attribute that to, but that a lot of times what I saw in more closed societies, when people had access to information opportunities, they generally wouldn't share it beyond their immediate network because they wanted to keep that information resource for themselves. And one of the things the U.S. has a lot of problems with, one of the great things about the U.S. is kind of open access to information. And so after living in Eastern Europe, I worked at a place called IREX, International Research and Exchanges Board. And one of the things I just started was an informal listserv about opportunities and jobs related to the region. And that just grew and grew and grew and grew to a huge level, just organically. And eventually some friends and I started a peacebuilding NGO, and we put that kind of list into the NGO and created a fee-for-service job site. And PCDN is what I wanted to do 20 years ago, just the technology didn't exist. And with the NGO, we hired 2 IT companies to do customized websites that promised us the world in terms of a pure horizontal networking platform. Neither company delivered. So basically what we're stuck with was one-way distribution of information. And then eventually, I'm still on the board of that NGO, but eventually the technology collapsed. And this is one of the challenges of, rapidly emerging technology is how do you ensure what you're using for your organization or service providers is reliable and going to stay around for the long term. And so basically, eventually someone told me about the technology platform that I used for PCDN. And when I saw, I was like, this is what I always wanted to do. And so I set up PCDN. It was an entirely volunteer-run effort for about 4 years. And then it grew to such a point that it was impossible to sustain just with volunteer time. And so we set it up as a sustainable enterprise. And there's several reasons for doing that. One, I'm still on lots of nonprofit boards, but I'm very burnt out on the donor-driven fundraising model that takes place in a lot of development in peacebuilding. So I wanted to demonstrate here's an enterprise that can sustain its operations, do social good, provide a service, and hopefully inspire others. And 2 is I didn't want to go through the whole donor-driven model of asking for grants that are short-term in nature. And 3 is I've always been passionate about business. So the class that's probably my favorite one I teach at Georgetown is looking at private sector actors in development. And traditional development or humanitarian relief is very important. But if you look at the scale, there's about 130, numbers go up and down, but about 130 billion each year is spent on international development. But if you look at kind of global foreign direct investment or even diaspora remittances, diaspora remittances where people living outside their countries send money back to their home countries is probably $350 to $400 billion a year. And foreign direct investments is over $1 trillion, with half of that going to developing societies. One of the things I've become increasingly convinced of over the past decade is that development is incredibly important, but again, it tends to be short-term in nature, unsustainable, and that to really affect long-term positive change, that private sector actors need to be involved. And so kind of PCN is the hopefully demonstrating in a very small capacity those various aspects. And so we've grown to 33,000, and we want to grow to 500,000 if we can. We'll see. So we have a strong vision, and we kind of a plan for how to get there. And it's been a wonderful social experiment. Basically, as our revenue grows, then we can hire more staff. And if our revenue doesn't grow, we can't. So, so it's interesting to have that kind of model.
So rather than a donation-driven model, what is the model? Is it advertising-based? Is it project-based membership fees?
So we have 4 sources of revenue. So we do ask people to pay, but it's voluntary. And so only about 2.7% of our membership pays. And, a lot of people give $1, some it's $5, some it's $10. But 77% of the revenue is through advertising. So these are largely institutions, graduate programs, fellowships, U.S. training programs that are trying to attract the type of population we have on PCDN. And then we have organizational members, and then we have employers. So those four sources of revenue, it's not providing enough to get to the scale we want. So we're trying to grow each, and we're also doing this new website to see if that'll help us grow.
Excellent. So how do you divide your time between, as you said, your two major full-time jobs? Are you able to check in with the network enough, or do you have to sacrifice one for the other often? Or?
I mean, Georgetown, is my full-time job, and I've been associate director for many years now. I'm interim director, so this is my priority. But I do carve out time every day, or at least one day a week, to really do PCDN stuff. And because we now have staff, that takes, if we're going to grow it, this is the time to do that. So so it is challenging during the academic year. In the summers, I have a lot more free time, so it's not as challenging. But I'd say it's not easy to have two jobs, but both are my passion. So it's not like I like one more than the other.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions I like to ask every guest here on Terms of Reference is about a time that you failed. We like to talk about our successes. We like to talk about, how things have grown and how we've been successful. Is there just either something about the network or something about your work, supporting other organizations where, you were a part of an initiative that just didn't work out? Or, you put forward an initiative and it just fell flat on its face. Tell us about that, and how did you recover from it, or what did you do to turn the situation around?
So I think celebrating failure is one of the things we don't do enough in the field. And there's a movement that's come out of the tech industry called Telfair, which has crossed over to international development. There's Engineers Without Borders, and some others have done conferences around this, but there's still not enough. The most spectacular failure I'd say I've done is not currently, but with the NGO I set up with some colleagues in '99, the Alliance for Conflict Transformation. That was my sole job for many years, or sometimes full-time, sometimes consultant. And we saved up, we had a wonderful brand name, and we're still around doing active work, but really saved up a lot of admin money and made this commitment to build the organization. So, invested in having full-time staff and benefits. And then basically last year I worked there. It wound up being full-time, more than full-time work for half-time pay with no benefits. And, the vision was we're going to grow this into at least a significant player. And in the end, despite writing millions of dollars worth of grants and lots of opportunities we pursued, it didn't work. So I'd say that, is probably the strongest personal failure I've had in terms of really being passionate about an organization I helped found, building it up over time. And then when it came to that critical decision, are we going to really grow into something? We already had a good name, but are we really going to scale it up? It didn't work. And so that was incredibly frustrating, and also just a high level of burnout.
You've probably just touched on something that many people listening to this podcast who are either owners of small organizations or founders of NGOs are either about to confront, are confronting, or have confronted. What was the straw, or what was the gap that you weren't able to scale? Was it just getting the team, your leadership, to continue to push forward? Was it a failed business model? Was it too much competition? You weren't able to compete effectively? Or was there any one thing, or was it?
I wouldn't say it's one thing, because we had a very good name. Our revenue probably got up to about 400,000 at the height, maybe 350, 400, and we had a lot of contracts, with major NGOs, from International Rescue Committee to, a lot of the major NGOs were coming to us. But the failure was, I think, we didn't have enough fundraising expertise among the team. So we were too top heavy, so we didn't have enough junior people. And then part of the larger transition is that Peacebuilding, everybody started moving in that direction. So instead of larger NGOs hiring smaller Peacebuilding NGOs to assist them, they all started developing their own in-house technical capacity.
Sure.
So I think it was a combination of all those things, and maybe we just weren't the best or most brilliant business people or proposal writers. I'm on the board, I'm not doing projects, so we're still, our revenues come back up. People are still doing very active work. So it's still a vibrant organization, but it didn't reach the level we thought it could have. And again, personally, full-time work for half-time pay with no benefits after a year, I'm like, I can't do this anymore.
Absolutely.
I think that's something a lot of people are attracted to our respective fields out of the desire to do social good. And there's a lot of volunteer work, and that's all wonderful. But there is this challenge of how do you sustain yourself both financially and just emotionally, mentally in very challenging contexts. And it's something I think in the field there's not enough discussion of. I'm not even talking about people going out to, war zones or humanitarian crisis, the self-care that needs to happen there. I'm just talking kind of the aid bureaucracy in general.
I think that you need to work with us on Aidpreneur a lot more, because that's the whole focus of our site.
Great.
That's the entire focus of this initiative. Gosh, there's so many doors. I feel like, we've had quite a nice arc to this conversation. Two more questions for you. You have grown the network, and you've outlined how you'd like to continue to grow it. It's a for-profit entity. You can see where the future is going. Is there a particular thing that you want to see in the peace building and conflict resolution community, or the larger community, in the next 5 years that you can kind of see coming down the road that you say, this is the future, this is the way that we need to go? Is it more of the same, or are there new ways to approach peace building and conflict resolution that you think are starting to take hold, such as using technology or something else?
So I'd say my personal passion is that I really think that we need to be both engaging with the private sector much more and kind of creating private sector initiatives to foster peace. So there's a lot of discussion about the triple bottom line in business, which is people, planet, profit. And we need to have a quadruple bottom line, which, is a little idealistic, but people, planet, profit, and peace. The class I've been teaching at Georgetown on business and peace building for years, always gets reviewed really well. People enjoy it, but for many years, people would just take it like, oh, it's interesting. But it's getting now, particularly the last 2 years, is the people taking the class, this is what they are already doing or want to do. So to me, I think we need a whole army of peace entrepreneurs or peacepreneurs that understand private sector market-based initiatives and peace building, and are thinking about how do we create a market to sustain whatever social good we're trying to create. Of course, keeping in mind that not all market-based initiatives are good, and there's a lot of unethical, destructive behavior. But to me, that's the thing. I see so many people coming out of master's degrees or undergraduate degrees in development or peace building or gender, and they're filled with all these ideals, but they don't understand the business of kind of larger aid industry. And a lot of people don't have the basic entrepreneurial skills they need, I think, to be successful. So they get stuck in kind of the aid system. And so to me, I think we need many more people actively seeking out entrepreneurship. And so, for example, one of my alum, she got hired at one of the world's largest oil service firms, being one of their key corporate social responsibility people. And when I heard that, I'm like, the impact that she can have within a large oil company, I just think is so exponentially higher than, let's say, someone working in the mid-level aid bureaucracy. And if you can affect a billion, whatever, $20 billion company, how they operate, again, one person may not be able to do that. But to me, I want to see a lot more people going out and thinking entrepreneurially, not just about getting donor money, but how do you generate stuff? And part of this has to do with, any society I've lived in or spent time when there's large-scale humanitarian or person suffering, there's a huge aid influx, and then after 5 or 10 years, the aid goes away. So it's also just a very practical question that aid is not going to create sustainable jobs in most cases. And so what happens is the aid industry builds up, whether it's in Bosnia or Cambodia, and after 5 or 10 years, the aid industry largely subsides. And unless, how do we create economic opportunities for people to have decent jobs? So I think that's probably the number one thing I would advocate.
That's fantastic. Last question for you. And you've alluded to this a couple of times, and I'm sure you get asked this all of the time as a professor and the central node of a huge network. But many of the people listening to this podcast are either interested in transitioning careers into development aid, peace work, or are those master's students that you teach every day. What's your critical piece of advice or pieces of advice that you give them about how to start a career, how to stay successful in this?
So the number one thing I would say is several things. So first of all, passion is not enough to sustain a career. You need passion and skills and to understand, again, the bureaucracy. I see too many people coming out of programs filled with a lot of passion and theory that's not connected to on-the-ground reality. And part of that is the challenge of how academics educate, and part of that's the challenge that people need to push themselves. And so the number one thing I would say, having a master's degree in conflict resolution from Georgetown or other universities or peace building or development is wonderful. And the MA is the new BA. So I don't want to say you have to have a graduate degree to be successful, because I know lots of people who don't, but it's increasingly becoming something that most people need to do if they want to advance. But what I would say is really taking advantage, so if you're going to grad school, take advantage of every opportunity to get applied practical skills that are not just the peace building or conflict resolution skills. And the way I would operationalize this, so there's at Georgetown, we're launching a series of 1-credit skills classes. We already have skills classes, but we're doing it across multiple MA programs and targeting the skills that we've identified based on research and talking to a lot of employers and alum. These are the things that people need to be critically successful entrepreneurs in the 21st century. So we're having, and they're not peace building skills, which are important, but we're doing classes on storytelling, social media for social change, fundraising, data visualization, policy writing. So these are skills that go across specific disciplines, and those are critically important for people to have successful careers or build their own career. And then the second thing I would say is, again, this is more for people going to grad school, is to root their studies and their expertise and not just get a degree, but find a geographic and or sectoral focus. Because the average job opening in DC that's publicly advertised now will have 300 job applications. And so how does someone differentiate themselves? Having a master's degree is wonderful, but that's not going to demonstrate enough skill. So if you want to do conflict resolution, think about what's an emerging trend. Is it gender, youth, tech, health, business? And be like, I'm a conflict resolution expert who's focused on empowering youth in economic development around energy. So try to find a focus that's going to root your skills and studies, that you're coming out not just with a generic set of skills that are very useful but harder to translate in the job market. And then for people who are already professionals who want to switch, the number one piece of advice is don't throw away your previous career, because often people sometimes, like, I've been working in tech for 10 years. I don't want to do tech. I want to do peace. But it's how do you reframe what you've already been doing, both the skills and the language, and what's relevant to peace building or development. And I guess the last one I would say, just, I guess there's 4 things total. The third thing would be find mentors, but don't go out and ask someone to be your mentor. It has to be an organic, original connection. But basically people who are doing cool things a little more senior than you that you can kind of run ideas by. And the fourth thing is there are a lot of fellowships out there that volunteering can be wonderful, but there are, there's the Fulbright Fellowship and the Boren Fellowship and the Rotary Peace Fellowship and the Acumen Fund and Echoing Green. I mean, there's many, many fellowship programs, and particularly now in social entrepreneurship, there's probably like 100 different fellowships people can apply for around not very peace building, but kind of social innovation that often will provide resources and or training to help you scale up and learn how to do the work more effectively.
Craig, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Sure. No, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.